What's the worst thing an American president has ever done? Write in the comments what you think about this. Enjoy the show. Story 1. One of the worst things many people would point to is when President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, leading to the forced relocation of thousands of Native Americans on the Trail of Tears. It's a dark chapter in U.S. history, causing immense suffering and loss of life. And it's something that still resonates deeply today as a huge injustice. Story 2. Lyndon Johnson's lying to Congress and the American people about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This led to the resolution, enabling Johnson to escalate the war, leading to the killing of over 50,000 Americans and wounding hundreds of thousands others. He became obsessed with a war he couldn't win. Burr persisted despite growing opposition in Congress and among the people. It was without a doubt the worst foreign policy decision in American history. Story 3. Suggesting a new path for a hurricane with a Sharpie. Suggesting injecting sunlight or bleach into your veins. On a more serious note, No Child Left Behind has turned into Make Education a Participation Trophy, and people are unable to even ask good questions anymore. Story 4. Implemented the first attempt by the Heritage Foundation to change America for the worse. You may have heard of Project 2025, right? This is the second attempt. The first attempt was about 60% completed when Reagan and his administration pushed it. Perhaps refer it as Project 1981. Look it up. You'll be shocked to see just how much of it turned to reality. Trickle-down economics are asses. Story 5. Nothing else comes close to an American president conspiring to overturn an election with false electors and by instigating the violent overthrow of the government by his despicable anti-American cultists. This is foundational shit, not foreign action shit or cultural impact shit. Story 6. Johnson and Jackson aside, Harry Truman often gets overlooked for dropping 2 atomic weapons on non-military targets, then patriating Nazi war criminals in Alabama, Operation Paperclip, to develop ICBMs, and then continuing to test said atomic weapons in the deserts of Nevada, which wound up killing thousands of our own citizens. CF. The movie Downwind, which is on Peacock, or the PBS documentary The Downwinders, is all pretty bad. The dude had a fetish for weapons of mass destruction. Story 7. Andrew Johnson is possibly number 1, but for more recent examples, George W. Bush lying and manipulating the evidence to cause the Iraq War debacle is near the top of the list too. Before the Iraq War, the United States was the undisputed world superpower and leader. In addition to losing trillions of dollars and thousands of soldiers' lives for literally nothing, the U.S. also lost its credibility and leadership. Story 8. Internationally objectively. The unrestricted bombing of Germany with the specific intention of firebombing civilian populations. The unrestricted bombing of Japan, Pres. Theodore Roosevelt and President Harry Truman, again specifically targeting civilian populations. Various bombing campaigns in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos under Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. We certainly entertained ourselves in Iraq, and the long game there is the unrestricted use of depleted uranium and the vast contamination of the Tigris-Euphrates and the rampant destruction of antiquities and decimation of Iraqi social support structures as a result. Domestically, as far as a single actor, almost certainly the Trail of Tears, President Andrew Jackson, and 100 years of anti-Aboriginal/anti-Indian policies, officially by the federal government. Institutional slavery under a variety of presidents, under multiple administrations, from colonial times for nearly 100 years in a de facto condition of millions of slaves. We spent another 150 years discriminating against various other populations, but I'm venturing to guess the lot of the average slave was none too good. The relocation camps for Japanese and German citizens under again Roosevelt was not good, and it's not beyond imagining that that could have easily become much worse. Story 9, I think it's a tie between 1. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams, Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, Tyler, Polk, Taylor, Fillmore, Pierce, and Buchanan, not ending inheritable chattel slavery, and 2. President Andrew Johnson killing reparations, for example, 40 acres and a mule, etc., and Reconstruction efforts after formerly enslaved were freed. I'm not sure which is worse. The current narrative is basically USA enslaved people, then freed them, told them they'd get reparations, but USA changed its mind. But their enslavers got reparations for lost property. And nearly 200 years later, the ancestors of the enslaved still struggle economically in the aggregate compared to other groups. To me, that's just a hell of a way to let the story end and claim to be good or a not racist country. Story 10. Got a crowd of idiots to attack the Capitol building to stop the certification of the most secure election in American history, then conspired with members of Congress and the Senate, state and county officials around the country to submit false electors and documents to overturn the official results of the election. then tried to intimidate the governor of a swing state to illegally change the results of the election. This was an attempted coup d'etat. Anyone who says otherwise is a liar. I can only be thankful that Donald J. Trump and the people around him were too stupid to pull it off. Story 11. I mean, there's kind of a lot to choose from. But worst in terms of most morally repugnant? Jackson and the Trail of Tears. Worst in terms of caused an event that directly threatened the integrity of our government and foundation of our country? Strong argument to be made for Trump and January 6th, even when factoring in recency bias. Honorable mentions to Nixon and Andrew Johnson in this category. Story 12. I think this question is highly subjective because of historical context, but in terms of singular actions, nothing pisses me off more quickly when brought up than the Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson was human garbage. But Andrew Johnson irreparably fucked the United States after the Civil War, gave us a chance to truly evolve into a modern democracy. Story 13. You could fill a book with disastrous presidential decisions that have had long-term repercussions in the U.S. with one example from each of the 46 presidents who have served in the office. However, I'd argue that James Polk declaring war on Mexico under false pretenses and launching the actual War of Northern Aggression in 1846 is a major contender in my view. Story 14. I agree with all of the stuff about Andrew Jackson and the mistreatment of Native Americans. I'm not trying to debate which is worse, just giving an alternate answer. This is probably going to be more controversial, but I personally would include Harry Truman's decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. My opinion on this has slowly shifted over the years the more I've read, and I've tried to approach the subject as objectively as possible. But the more I learn, the harder it is to justify. We had all of the momentum, and the argument that it would save us lives isn't quite so convincing upon learning that the Soviets had turned their focus entirely on Japan, and an invasion from their side was imminent. On multiple occasions, the United States had intercepted Japanese communications, indicating that Japan was exploring ways to surrender, provided they could retain the emperor and avoid a complete dismantling of their government. Japan made several attempts to use the Soviet Union as a mediator for peace negotiations with the Allies. Japan hoped that the Soviets, who were still neutral at the time, could help broker a deal that would allow Japan to surrender under certain conditions. After learning this, it's hard for me to come to any conclusion other than the bombs were primarily intended as a political and diplomatic weapon against the Soviet Union. Story 15. Everyone stated the obvious ones, but one I don't think I see here yet is what Trump did on J6. It's not mass death and all, which basically shaped who we and what are today, for better or worse, but the American experiment, which included all that, almost ended on January 6, 2021, because of what he did, and it still could end due to lack of accountability and money. Story 16. Built a platform on withdrawing from Afghanistan, spent 4 years refusing to plan the withdrawal by not reallocating troops to critical defense points, removing billions in equipment, or even setting a date so other military leaders can plan accordingly. Then waited until 3 weeks before leaving office to announce the withdrawal, while withholding national security briefs from the incoming administration, causing a total of 4 Joint Chiefs to end their careers and publish open letters to the American public directly citing national security concerns over someone's relationship with Russia, handling of Afghanistan, and blatant disregard for service members. Then secretly set a withdrawal date for just 4 months after the new president took over, leaving them to scramble a half-hearted plan together that was destined to fail. Then cheering for the current president's downfall as the troops he once oversaw fled for their lives. I think that was a good one. Story 17. Andrew Jackson's Indian policy was horrific. Andrew Johnson's opposition to congressional Reconstruction policy, and in particular to black civil rights, was horrific. In terms not of overall harm affected, but sheer cruelty, Trump's policy of family separation as a disincentive to migration is mind-bogglingly evil. Story 18. Jefferson raped and impregnated his 15-year-old enslaved sister-in-law, Sally Hemings. He impregnated her at least 5 more times. Plus, he enslaved approximately 600 people over his lifetime. Still, after exploiting all that free labor, he died in massive debt, and his estate need to auction off human beings, this splitting up many families forever, in order to bat creditors. Story 19. Worst ethical action was Jackson's Trail of Tears. Worst political action was Trump's January 6th insurrection, his denial of the election results for weeks, his speech the morning of January 6th, and the non-action for hours before his half-ass attempt asking them to stop. Story 20. President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which led to the forced relocation of tens of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States to territories west of the Mississippi River. This policy, known as the Trail of Tears, resulted in the deaths of thousands of Native Americans due to disease, exposure, and starvation. Story 21. Not that any American cares, but that the capital of Upper Canada still rankles. Burning Washington in retaliation feels somehow insufficient. Even though the British did so very methodically, burning only the White House, Capitol, and some other military structures, avoiding destruction and looting of private property, and retreating in good order, taking some choice works of art from the Capitol, which still hang in Ottawa today. 1. Americans quickly forgot this event, and it's not taught in schools too. My own personal jab on the matter was fun. I was having lunch with an American coworker who unwisely went into America fuck yeah mode about military feats, etc. I let him go on for a good 10 minutes, and when he finally paused for breath, I asked, "You mean like the time we burned Washington in the War of 1812? The goggly eyes, the sharp intake of breath, the you did not, was pretty priceless." In general, Americans have too much plot armor for their own good. Recently, official feelers went out for the return of said artwork. The answer was no. President Madison ran away crying. Story 22. Maybe not the worst ever, but here are some blemishes on various presidents I haven't seen people comment on yet. Harry Truman inserted the U.S. into the Korean War without consulting the rest of the government. Or initially the UN, also authorizing the atomic bomb, but that's beating a dead horse. Franklin Roosevelt sold out Poland to the Soviets in the name of defeating Japan, also authorizing Japanese internment camps. Woodrow Wilson stalled the feminist movement, possibly because women would most likely vote against American involvement in WW1. Ronald Reagan's economic policy gave the U.S. a wicked amount of debt we are still paying for today. Donald Trump downplaying COVID and not doing much about the pandemic caused American cases to spiral out of control. Joseph Biden indirectly supporting Israel and its terror methods in the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Abraham Lincoln suspended the freedom of press during the American Civil War, though he did it to stop misinformation. Herbert Hoover made some pretty bad economic calls during the Great Depression, such as killing international trade with high tariffs and shooting down public works projects that would help the floundering economy. Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon from the Watergate scandal, legally absolving both of them from all blame. Story 23. That's tough. Foreign or domestic, recent or distant past. Jackson and the Trail of Tears was monstrous. Andrew Johnson seriously fucked up Reconstruction. George W. Bush lied his ass off and started the Iraq fiasco. Trump screwed the pooch with his handling of COVID. He also has bromances with some of the worst dictators on the planet. The attempt to overturn the election and the attempted coup made the U.S. look like the worst banana republic. I have to give the worst president to Trump. He worked hard for that honor and all he got was 2 impeachments. Story 24. Unnecessarily dropping 2 atomic bombs, now the domestic stuff, doing nothing in regard to slavery, doing nothing in regard to mass incarceration, manifest destiny without treaties, Trail of Tears, dispossessing natives and Mexicans of their lands, a series of policies and laws regarding Asians and Latinos specifically, Jim Crow, and requiring a movement for civil rights, supply-side economics, NAFTA, GATT, the Patriot Act, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, the list goes on. The foreign stuff, name a continent. Story 25. I think if any other president had ordered Americans of a specific ethnic minority to be rounded up and put in concentration camps, it would have defined their legacy as one of the most horrible presidents yet. It ended up being a footnote in FDR's presidency and doesn't seem to impact him being considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest president of all time. Story 26. FDR going past 2 terms combined with the New Deal legislation set the precedent that it's okay for the president to inflate the federal government if we are scared of being poor. Me personally, I'd rather eat tripe every day and drink rainwater than risk authoritarianism. One could argue Lincoln committed a similar error, but his actions seem more justified to me in the context of slavery and secession of the South. Story 27. Blackmail a foreign country into providing false information about a U.S. citizen, incite violence, attempting to disrupt an official proceeding because an election was lost, have random Joe Schmoes pose as electoral official in an attempt to sway an election outcome with votes that aren't there, etc. The list goes on. Personal political opinion aside, history will not look fondly on the Trump admin. Lots of mob boss bees behind the scenes. Story 28. Bush's war in Iraq was pretty bad. It caused untold amounts of suffering, destabilized the region for years, trashed international relations, cost the U.S. a ton of money, and provided a fertile ground for religious extremists to flourish. We still have a military presence in the region to prevent ISIS from getting big again. You'd think that the Iraqi military would be able to handle that, as much money and equipment as the U.S. provided, but there was so much corruption that when the U.S. left, they showed themselves to not be a real fighting force. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, like it, be sure to write comments. and share your stories.